I give a lot of talks, a lot of tours of our center down in Richmond, and I always start everyone by saying we are at war. And I always use those first 4 words, and then I always spend 4 or 5 minutes explaining to folks who don't quite understand the United States is in a cyber war with China and Russia. Throw in Iran and North Korea, and it's been that way for years.
My guest today is the electrifying Sean Stalzer. Having spent over 30 years in the energy sector, Sean currently serves as the CISO of Dominion Energy, one of the largest utility companies in America and the power provider for the largest internet intersection in the world.
Roughly 9.5 times out of 10, anywhere in the world that you are, that electron has to pass through Loudoun County before it gets to its destination. Boy, would that be catastrophic if Loudoun County was offline for an hour a day. Bad guys are thinking about that, but so are the good guys.
Sean's work sees him defending the critical resource of electricity against an increasingly belligerent and capable adversary, and the challenges are plentiful. Sean is at the front line of the conflict and sees daily the threats we face.
I think the larger vulnerability that's growing, though, is the vulnerability of solar everywhere, and solar that's not owned by the big companies. And connecting to the grid to the point where at the wrong time, it could potentially be grid impacting if China got in and say shut off a whole bunch of them at once. The counter argument is, but I'm a little solar site. I don't matter. But in the aggregate, they do.
Our conversation explores not just cybersecurity, but the resilience of our grid and our society against cyber threats, and brings light to the culture of service that powers our nation. In short, I'm positive you'll find this conversation energizing. All puns intended. And now, here's Sean Stalzer. So Sean, welcome to the Watchers. You are the CISO, as we say, or CISO, or some people say CISO. CISO, that's one way of doing it, of Dominion Energy. And we're going to jump right in because I'm going to ask you, why does a energy company that provides electricity and power need a cybersecurity anything?
Wow. So that's a good question, and not where I thought you were going to go first. So I think
keep you on your toes.
Yeah, the biggest learning I get is when I took into this job and we started bringing in folks to look at an energy company, like government folks and such, is very few people actually understand what an energy company does. You think of the bucket trucks and the linemen, which absolutely core business, right? Keep the lights on, get the branches off the tree, connect the houses and such. However, nothing in the world works without energy. So at the end of the day, if the power company goes down, I don't care what else you do for a job, it ceases to exist until the power's back on. And we all experience that: thunderstorms, hurricanes, blizzards, that kind of thing. But from a cyber perspective, it is energy sector, the first strike target for China and Russia. So if you believe sort of the pundits in the government space, in 2027, maybe as late as 2030, China invades Taiwan, the first strike is disable the power grid. Perhaps not permanently, it's not maybe not their goal, but to say, hey, current administration, back off. Right. I can do worse to you if you don't stop.
Affect our power grid.
But
as they make those actions as a way of...
If you think of it, you got a lot of your Marines would be first to respond. How do you get Marines from Quantico and all the East Coast camps across the United States onto ships to go across the Pacific if there's no power across the United States? Or do you send a message to the lawmakers in D.C.? Hey, Senator and Congressman, nobody's kids can watch Netflix and they can't buy on Amazon, and I can do it to you again. Back off. Let me have Taiwan.
I'm sure you want to have this fight.
Absolutely.
So do we have the sort of vulnerabilities or exposure that we have infrastructure that can be impacted in that way that can bring the power grid down?
I mean, I think every so often you see Congress will come out and say the power grid's a D. Not really. If you think about the power grid, there are over 300 utilities in the United States, but there's a big 25 of us that are the vast, vast majority of Americans. Well over 85% of Americans get power from the big ones. The Dukes, the Southerns, the Dominions, AEPs, right, NextEras, sort of the names people know. Those companies are pretty solid, not only because, a long time ago we got regulated, which made us start thinking about the problem set, but because those companies, being shareholder-driven companies, are trying to do the right thing, trying to keep the lights on, right? You don't want to go down. The tougher ones are the many, many smaller ones who have 30,000 customers and they're serving something like a Fredericksburg, and they don't have a large budget in a large area. Those are more vulnerable only because of less money that they can put towards the problem set and less time that they've had to conform with regulations and do the problem set. But like Netflix is 0 day. Are we going to have a massive outage of everything once? No, we're not going to have that. But can people be impacted? Absolutely. Anything connected to the internet, right? Anything that has a wire to it can potentially be impacted.
Is there, for Dominion's a massive company. How big is Dominion? Like how many? Do you know how many constituents it serves?
At one point in time, it was 1 in 10 Americans. We have divested of our gas business now, so it's really Virginia. It is some into North Carolina, the eastern part of North Carolina, and much of South Carolina at this point. A lot of military bases, though, so we have a lot of infrastructure in that space.
So energy providers of that size and scale, is there that kind of like infrastructure, IT infrastructure, that can be impacted in such a way that can bring a company of Dominion size down?
And the answer, unfortunately, is it depends, right? So if there's 6 or 7 of us, and Dominion is one of them, who the things that make and move energy are deep inside our network and never exposed to the internet. Because many, many years ago, we said, hey, we've got substations 2 hours from the nearest town. And there's no telephone line out there. I know, we'll have our own telecom company and we'll string copper wire. And so we would do that so we could talk to our folks way out in the field. Yeah. And then as technology advanced, right, we put in fiber optics and such. So now we have wires everywhere. So I don't need to send a command to a substation to take an action or to a power plant that goes out through Verizon or AT&T or out to the internet. It stays internally. Whole different posture when all of your core stuff is, some of it never accessible other than by walking up to it, and other things inside layer upon layer upon layer. But I said 6 or 7, and I said there's 25 big ones. And so there's a bunch of others that unfortunately have to send things out to the internet, come back in from the internet into their perimeter, makes them more vulnerable. Not that they are vulnerable, right? The power grid does a lot to protect itself.
Sure.
But again, you put a wire anywhere and people can start beating on it, and that just gives you vulnerability.
And so the big companies may be more resilient, but you have I don't know if you would call a supply chain necessarily, but there are other providers in the grid who are more vulnerable because they haven't made the right changes or the right moves, or?
I think that's absolutely true. I think the larger vulnerability that's growing, though, is the vulnerability of solar everywhere and solar that's not owned by the big companies.
Okay.
So let's expand upon that a little bit. So if you're inside of a Duke or a Dominion or a Southern or somebody like that, and you stand up a solar field, you apply all kinds of security controls to it. You have it inside your perimeter, and you might see it in the middle of a field somewhere, but effectively it's deep inside the electronic perimeter. But if Joe Schmo's warehouse stands up a 10 megawatt solar field, well, Virginia's 22,500 megawatts. 10 megawatts out of that is a nothing.
Sure.
We have ups and downs as people turn on their air conditioning and heat and come home and turn on their TVs that fluctuate like that all the time. And the grid is built to handle that. But it's not just Joe Schmo's warehouse. It's the hospital and the school and the 7 other warehouses and so on. So now it's hundreds, if not thousands of megawatts of these little solar fields out there that I don't get to do cybersecurity for. I don't get to tell them what to do. Instead, the way the law kind of works is, and I'm oversimplifying it, but
sure,
if you are electrically sound, if you are complying with all the electrical stuff, we have to let you connect to the grid. Okay, well, there's nothing in that what I just said that says if you're cyber secure. And instead, the most common way to build those sites is literally drop a Comcast modem,
sure,
connect it to the internet. The ones we have had experience with are often default passwords. And hey, do you patch things? Why? Right? Do you change your passwords regularly?
It's just a solar panel.
It's just a solar panel, right? Who cares? And so at the end of the day, what you're seeing across the country is that amount of solar growing and connecting to the grid to the point where at the wrong time, it could potentially be grid impacting if China got in and say, shut off a whole bunch of them at once. The counter argument is, but I'm a little solar site. I don't matter. But in the aggregate, they do. And so like Virginia has legislation right now pending Governor Youngkin's signature to actually address that. But a lot of other states don't.
So is the problem then that as they plug into the grid and you guys have to let them into the grid, they're not taking any action or not enough action around cybersecurity, but the grid and in the overall calculation of how much energy we need to produce, we're adding them in and counting on them to stay up?
Exactly. They become part of the calculus where they are putting energy on the grid that we are in essence forced to take. And therefore, over the course of time, it's not like you have these giant plants sitting idle, right? Who's going to build a multi-billion-dollar plant to sit idle and hope one day the solar site turns off so you can come online? So you obviously build in capacity, resilience, redundancy into your grid planning, but you don't sit out there with 2 idle nuclear plants waiting to come online. I mean, that's not a thing that anybody would ever say to do.
People would be pretty upset if that was what happened.
And so at the end of the day, I think as we as a country push more towards that, obviously battery storage is a equalizer. Right now you're getting capacity out there, but battery storage at that scale they're huge, right? They're sizes of semi trucks or small houses, and it takes lots and lots and lots of them. So it's going to take us a while to sort of catch up with the proliferation of solar with the proliferation of batteries and other sources of dispatchables, what we call it, right? Generation that can come online right away. Think of it as a giant generator for your house kind of thing. Of
course.
To sort of even out that load. But if we keep going down that path where eventually solar's everywhere, we have to think about the problem set differently. And our view is the solution is more cyber, right? Let's protect them. Let's not have the Comcast modem on the internet.
Yeah.
Let's make sure we apply patches. Just the basics, make it a harder target.
So in solving maybe an energy production problem, we create a new problem.
Yep.
That's kind of how I guess it always works. Solutioning always creates new problems.
It does, and the government's certainly been aware of it for a few years, but things are slow to move. And I think Virginia will lead in that space. The bill in front of Governor Youngkin now basically says, hey, Virginia, we recognize the problem. Let's build a task team of all the right people, right? You want the solar side represented with the utility side, with the regulator side, and everything of what is the right cybersecurity controls. And then that committee will come out with here's what you must do. And so magically we'll suddenly have a couple thousand megawatts of solar that is now much more protected than it is today.
That's good. That's I was surprised when we first talked and you brought this up in conversation. You kind of assume when power companies are just, the linemen and all the physical stuff you think of, you don't think a whole lot about the infrastructure behind it all. But I had never thought about this idea of smaller sites coming online as anything other than a great thing. Like, hey, more solar, more green energy getting on the grid. Like that's all great. But that's an interesting insight that we're increasingly reliant on these things.
Yeah, being increasingly, green energy is a good thing.
Of course.
But we just need to do it responsibly. And I think that's the challenge today of if you look at each individual site on its own merits, it doesn't necessarily warrant, I need cyber on that. But they don't operate on their own. They operate as part of what really is the world's largest machine. That's what the power grid is. It is a large interconnected machine. Virginia isn't Virginia. Virginia is part of the Eastern Interconnect, which is part of the country, which actually, as we know from the tariffs last week, connects into Canada.
Yeah.
And so the point is it's a large interconnected machine where decisions at scale can start to matter.
Now, maybe from a political standpoint, we won't delve into politics necessarily, but it has been a talking point, I think, on both sides, really, that our energy grid lacks resilience. I've heard the criticism of the grid is like, hey, it's always on the precipice. Like it's always one minor thing can set us over. Is that fear mongering? Is there some reality to that?
I think, given the caveat, I'm not one of our grid engineers, but I am an electrical engineer and I do sit with those guys. I'd say our folks would tell you, no, we're not one hiccup from everything catastrophically going down. And if you think about it over the summer, thunderstorms that roll through the state are big hiccups, right? They can take out entire counties, right? Or sometimes many counties, and the grid doesn't magically go down, right? There's a lot of resilience built into it. It is a very interconnected, very, very tough sort of machine that's out there doing it. And so there's always room to improve. There's always things we'd love to do more of and that we will advance technology on. But no, the grid's not this fragile thing that the next snowstorm is going to black out the country, because that just doesn't happen.
When there are major outages, is there a lot of structure and a lot of, I don't know, programmatics necessarily is the word, but you think of natural disasters, we have FEMA on standby. We know there are people poised to take action. Does that exist in the energy infrastructure?
Oh, absolutely.
As well?
Both on the physical, let's restore, and also on the cyber side. We call it mutual aid.
Okay.
And so because we are in essence regulated, I don't want to call them monopolies, but regulated companies within our region, right? We are kind of the power company for here, as an example. You can't go hire somebody else. You have to get us.
You are my only option. Yes.
Right. We're not competing with anybody else. Instead, we're cooperating. And because we're an interconnected machine, there's even more emphasis there to cooperate. We are one interconnected machine, so to speak. And so when we know that storm is coming to Florida, trucks are already rolling south. We know that storm's not going to hit Virginia. You'll see Dominion trucks in Florida awaiting that storm to hit because Florida said, ooh, this is going to be bad. We need mutual aid. And we all respond to that. And that's why you'll see other states' trucks in Virginia during major storms that hit here, or third parties, right? You'll see a lot of third party contractors that get pulled in on that. Cyber side's the same thing. We actually have mutual aid there where I could say, I have a major cyber attack. I need help. And I might get folks from a Duke or a Southern or an AEP that come over. We haven't had to do that yet, but it exists and we exercise it and we have the agreements in place.
So in my other world, my other life, I'm a paramedic. I've been doing that about as long as I've been in IT as a paramedic. And for a time I was a firefighter. We have mutual aid agreements with counties next door where when they're getting overrun, we send trucks up or over and vice versa.
It's very much the same concept.
So similar, like having first responders. I mean, cyber first responders in a way. Hey, when you guys are having a big incident, we got staff, and the expectation or agreement is if it happens to us, you'll.
And sometimes that's short term, right? It's for a few days to help them out, but sometimes it's long term. You might remember when Puerto Rico got hit a few years ago and the entire grid went down. We sent a barge full of trucks and several hundred folks who just kind of lived down there for several weeks and into a couple of months just to restore power. And so the mutual aid goes a lot more than just I'm here for the moment. It's how do we get the grid back up and serve our customers? That's just sort of the DNA of the power company. And that extends into the cyber side of if it happens, how do we get the grid back up and serve our customers?
Now, you've been in this industry for almost 30 years, or has it been 30 years?
My 31st year will be this November.
Okay, so it's been 30. Yeah. Wow, okay. I imagine a lot has changed in that time. Was there a cybersecurity department when you started?
There wasn't a cybersecurity department when I got my job here doing this current role. When I first started, there was Novell servers, which to any non-geek out there doesn't really exist as a thing companies use anymore. And if you wanted to get out to the internet, you used a dial-up modem that screamed through a telephone line. You hope nobody picked up the phone while it was on because it was going to disconnect you. At that time, I don't believe my password changed for the first few years. And then as I moved forward in my career into IT and did a lot of the geeky jobs there, at one point I was the lead over all the databases. And we had one password for every database because I wanted it simple on my support staff. And it made complete sense. I needed my guys to respond after hours. We needed everybody to know how to get in. We had one standard for everything and one password. And that, of course, is a dumb decision in today's world and view. Sure. The point is absolutely it has changed from a whole mindset of give everybody access to do everything to give people the tools to do their job, but in a secure way.
Yeah, I can remember sometimes I think back and cringe on some of the decisions I made as a young IT engineer or support tech. The amount of things that I did out of convenience, opening certain things to, let me open up RDP on this public IP because hey, I want to hit this from home,
right?
And just a username and password to get in. Now you think on that, you're like, that's like rule number one. You never would do that. So a large energy company like Dominion, tell me about its cyber operations. What sort of capabilities do you all have or do companies like you have? And what are you protecting against? What are you fighting against?
What are we fighting against? I think we're fighting against, the common stuff, right? Criminal groups, obviously. You're fighting against activists and hacktivists attempting to get in and deface things. But the real threat is obviously nation states. And I give a lot of talks, a lot of tours of our center down in Richmond. And I always start everyone by saying we are at war. And I always use those first 4 words. And then I always spend 4 or 5 minutes explaining to folks who don't quite understand the United States is in a cyber war with China and Russia. Throw in Iran and North Korea. And it's been that way for years. And each China and Russia have a public statement, right? They're the China 2025 plan, the 5-year plans they put out. Russia's, Putin has put out his statements, which is we are building weapons and we have a national goal to take down the United States, break the power grid, destabilize the economy, and on down the line. So if you take them at their word, even if you know nothing about what's going on behind the scenes in cyberspace and you just take them at their word, they are here to bring down the United States and the power grid and the gas sector and the water sector and all of the major sort of critical infrastructure sectors are targets of theirs, and they are attempting to do that. So that's what we defend against. That's what we build to. So we build to the worst case scenario like that. We do everything soup to nuts that you can think of in the cyberspace. There's almost nothing utility doesn't do, from the let me protect the endpoint to what do I do on the mobile devices to how do I harden the things that make and move energy, or in the water sector make and move water, right? And that kind of thing through collaboration with others. Because one of the big talking points we put out is cybersecurity is a team sport, right? I have 20-ish folks in my SOC. I have 70-ish folks overall. And there's hundreds of people in the business that do functions. But at the end of the day, North Korea's got 7,000 bad guys. I don't have 7,000 good guys. And they're the tiniest one, right? Iran's got 35, 40,000.
They're like the least capable.
Least capable. Russia's got 100, 120,000. China's got 1.4 million. You can take classes in Chinese universities for a hack and fill in a company name. They are churning out folks whose job and whose life it is to breach our companies at numbers that are staggering. So the point is it's a team sport. So a big part of a cybersecurity defense plan is collaboration with the government, with peers, with private sector companies that can supply services to you. And it's how do you build that web of defense, that mutual aid in a large way, so that when a bad day happens, you're ready.
So these nation states have stated goal to come after companies like you. That's a little intimidating, a little threatening. In the space I'm in, I work a lot with defense contractors. often further down in the supply chain, and it feels a little more nebulous of a threat. Like obviously we know China and Russia wants to interrupt us, but are they really targeting, the mom and pop machine shop in a rural area? Maybe, but you're a stated target. And you're
stated target, and not only a stated target, but I see the activity, right? I measure Volt Typhoon, which is the China's People's Liberation Army, whose mission set is take down critical infrastructure. That is their entire purpose in life. I see them attempting to breach the perimeter. I see them using their attacks. And not only do I see them, but NSA, for example, who sits on the perimeter, as it does for most of the defense industry, right, is watching them and reporting them. And Homeland Security is seeing them. And so, yeah, it's not theory. It's reality that they're trying it.
What kind of damage could they do if they brought down a Dominion?
If you could bring down a large company, a large power company, there's a lot of things that could happen. It depends what time of the year you do it, and it depends what type of obviously damage you do. But at the very least, if you were to shut down a major power company, you're kind of blacking out that section of the country for a period of time. But like I said, this is an interconnected machine. So if you're doing it at the wrong time and you're doing it in a catastrophic way, can you create a ripple effect that ripples throughout whatever that region of the country is? There's some neat models that float around in the electrical engineering space around the 2003 blackout that happened and how fast that rippled and how far it rippled, because it was way up in the Northeast Canada border, and you can see it through the grid ripple all the way down to Florida and kind of echo back in milliseconds. Wow. So we're talking about things that happen at the speed of light. Yeah. Now, granted, the grids are hardened. They're designed. Things are designed to break open and trip and such to deal with that. But what if you're a state that is a net importer of power? California is a good example, right? They don't have enough generation in California to run the state. It's really, really hot. Air conditioners are blowing, and the states that supply you suddenly go down. Well, then California probably goes down at the end of the day. Now, I'm not saying PGE or Southern Cal Edison is vulnerable. I'm just saying that the net math of I need more power than I physically have, makes that a potential reality. And that's why all the big utilities invest so much money into being secure.
So then we can imagine what all the various things that lack of electricity will bring down from a pure sustainment of life scenario.
Oh, sure. I mean, I think the simple reality is most of life runs through the internet these days, right? Even your cell phone call runs through the internet. Once it hits the tower, it runs through the internet and emerges on a tower somewhere else. Most of the internet is here, right. Where we are today, right? It's not. It's within 10 miles of where we are today,
which is we're in Loudoun County.
Yep, and that is roughly 9.5 times out of 10, anywhere in the world that you are, that electron has to pass through Loudoun County before it gets to its destination. Boy, would that be catastrophic if Loudoun County was offline for an hour a day. And so, bad guys are thinking about that, but so are the good guys, right? So is CIA and NSA and FBI and everybody else. And so it's quite the cat and mouse game that goes on out there.
Do you think somewhere there's a battle plan in a Chinese military unit about making a big move by bringing down Loudoun County for a time to interrupt the internet while they do whatever they're going to do?
I mean, when you're sitting around, after a session, having a drink with friends in the government, they'll tell you, I don't think I know. I've never seen it, but I mean, certainly I've had plenty of those conversations where it's like, yeah, absolutely. Of course they have that. And of course, we have whatever our equivalent is. And that's what you need to defend against.
It's kind of terrifying.
It is a little bit.
Do you sleep okay?
I mean, you do it long enough and it's kind of normal, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But I do a lot of tours for employees. Like every employee in the company talks to me in some way, usually large meetings, but give a lot of tours so folks can see it sort of firsthand. And I was in the cafeteria just yesterday, and the lady whose group sets up these tours comes up and she goes, I was just in the elevator and these two young ladies were in there. And one said, the only tour I haven't done yet is the cyber tour. And the other lady said, me too, but I hear it's really scary. And so...
Yeah, it's a kind of a scary reality, not just in your sector. Cybersecurity generally, I was thinking, as you said, we're at war. One of the common questions that I mostly stopped asking when we bring guests on is like, are we in a state of war? And I think this might be episode 23, 24, something like that. Every single one is like, we have been.
Absolutely.
And the American public kind of still doesn't realize it, maybe because it lacks a kinetic impact. And I think our enemies know that if they made it feel more kinetic, the American public would be more aware of it and demand more. But because they're just insidious enough, they've only recently, in my estimation, really started to cross the line where it's really starting to impact in a kinetic way by things like Volt Typhoon.
Yep. And certainly Ukraine is a great place for Russia to try it. And I've been waiting for it to get declassified because I still haven't heard of it. Early in the war, it was April, May of the first year of the war, a bunch of articles emerged from Ukraine. And one of them was focused on a substation that blew up. If I say that to any engineer in the power industry, they go, substations don't blow up, but you can break things. And then the other ones was about a power plant blowing up, both from cyber attack. And so what's fascinating about that is Russia used some level of capability in the cyberspace to impact the Ukrainian grid different than they did back in 2015, 2017 with those attacks in a live sort of war setting. So even then, 3 years ago, they're testing weapons in the cyberspace targeted at the power grid. And they don't just give up, right? Bad guys don't go, oh, you caught me, or I tested it, I'm done, right? They're going to iterate and they're going to come back at you again. And so all throughout this period, you've seen Ukraine attacking Russian assets in cyberspace and Russia returning the favor. And so, yeah, they're practicing their weapons now. They might not be in Nebraska, but it's the same weapon at the end of the day.
Right. And in their scenario, Russia can hit Ukraine with things like cruise missiles. They could hit us with ICBMs and whatnot, but I don't think we're going to go that far, but they can certainly reach us over the internet.
Absolutely. And the scary part with China is there's a number of open source reports last year that really started to emerge and then died down. But the reports were basically around coming through Panama and then across the Mexico border was an estimated 40,000 Chinese military aged males pre-positioned in the United States. They didn't come for a job. They came to disappear into the country. So is there a kinetic threat out there? I don't know. That was an open source report that made its way around for a while. But the point is they have to be thinking about kinetic too. And so when we think about defense as a power company, we think about both. We think about the kinetic and the cyber as an integrated threat.
Right. You have to assume in that stated battle plan that's out there about how to bring Loudoun County down or bring down the Mid-Atlantic region, it's going to be kinetic and it's going to be in cyberspace. It'll hit us on every front and it'll be coordinated.
Yep.
Again, kind of terrifying.
Kind of terrifying.
How do you plan against that?
The good news, though, is that you've got a lot of smart engineers planning for that. And if you think about the power grid isn't a simple wire from your house to a plant, right? It is an incredibly complicated web with multiple paths through different ways to get power from a plant to your house and back again. And then regions that are interconnected in multiple ways. And it's an extremely complicated thing. So it's difficult when you say there's tens of thousands of substations across the United States. I'm going to blow them up. No, you're not. You're going to hit some key ones. We're going to have counters for that, whether it's a mobile substation, whether it's replacement equipment, whether it's routing power through a different path, whether it's a particular area that it's going to take us a little bit longer to get that area up, but the major stuff is back up. And there's a lot of variations on contingency plans there that folks think through. And part of that analysis is required of us by regulation, and part of that is because it's just good business to understand if a hurricane comes through and takes out those substations, what do you do? And so we benefit as an industry by natural disaster. That's an odd thing to say, right? You don't want a natural disaster, but it forces you to think it through and then to actually do it in real time. Because unfortunately, every year there's wildfires, there's hurricanes, there's tornadoes, there's blizzards, et cetera. There's people driving into poles. Right. There are disasters that happen on a regular basis. Times. So you get some benefit there from the idea of A, how do I get more resilient? How do I stop that from happening? And then B, how do I recover from it when it does happen?
So let's talk about one of the threats you mentioned, Volt Typhoon. I hear a lot about, and I imagine a lot of people in the cybersecurity domain industry have heard about Volt Typhoon. What exactly is Volt Typhoon, and what have they done?
So Volt Typhoon is a unit of the People's Liberation Army of China. Their entire mission set is break into the United States critical infrastructure with a heavy focus on the energy sector and basically get a foothold in there. There's just an article this week that they were in a Massachusetts utility for 300 days undetected. Since we know the big utilities up there and they weren't in them, it had to be one of those little small ones we're talking about that they're referring to. But the point is that's their job. Get pre-positioned, have access, and then upon command, turn things off, right? That's the whole doomsday scenario you were kind of talking about is their mission set. They're very, very good at what they do. Obviously highly funded, highly capable, but we're also, as a nation, pretty darn good at countering them. For example, NSA, very good at finding them and helping companies get rid of them. DHS good, FBI good, et cetera. But their claim to fame is sort of the very professional, but very methodical and very, very slow at what they do. I'll give you an example. We get attacked 3 billion times a month. So 100 million attacks a day. They might hit me 25 times in a month. How am I trying to find 25 little needles in a big pile of needles?
Right, yeah.
And so it's a difficult problem set by virtue of how they do it. And they don't do it by necessarily writing brand new custom code. They do it by, there's a new vulnerability for this technology product. Let me just do a quick test. Do they even have that product? Okay, cool. I'm going to go away. Come back a few months later. Is that vulnerability open that nobody's thinking about anymore? Okay, cool. I can exploit that and work my way in. And so it's very methodical, and it's almost insidious in the way that they'll work in, and they do it with a intentional design to not get detected.
More surgical than brute force.
Absolutely. Yeah. 10 years ago, China was so loud.
Yeah.
I mean, their entire attack method was beat on everything, get in, and then steal every piece of data. So if anybody was watching, but none of us had real robust programs back then, if anybody was watching, you would have just seen this tidal wave smash into your wall and then everything getting sucked out the door. That's not
pretty easy to see on a graph. You're like, that's weird.
Absolutely.
That's a big spike.
But in today's world, that's not how they operate.
And that makes me think maybe about a bit of the history around cybersecurity. I mean, criminal gangs and everyone used to be so unsophisticated. The attacks used to be like brute force, and one of the earliest cyber attacks I ever remember working was an RDP server open to the internet. And going back and looking through the logs, you're like, wow, for like 45 days,
right,
this thing was getting hit every second with a login attempt. And like, yeah, the math just works out that eventually they brute force their way in. But nowadays, that's going to trigger any EDR solution or any SOC. That's like 101 level stuff they're monitoring. So the attackers it's like you said, a cat and mouse game. They get a little better, we get a little better, and they have to iterate, we have to iterate.
And that's the challenge, is how much does your SOC and those kind of teams iterate? For example, when I started in this role 6.5 years ago, we had 64 things, 64 scenarios the SOC would look for. And they were perfectly good, awesome things. We now have over 400. And every month, 100 and 150 of those will change, because we'll learn something new and we'll have to iterate and change those. So it's not even 400 static ones. We'll add 5 or 10 or 15 and we'll change 100, 150 to keep up with the Joneses, so to speak, because bad guys are always pivoting.
That's one of the things I fear people who aren't in cybersecurity, haven't been a defender on a blue team, don't really understand is how much of this needs to be maintained and serviced. It's, often in the world I live in, I work with a lot of executives, business decision makers and whatnot at organizations, and their perception is still very much, okay, you guys just got to come in and turn a couple switches on for us. You got to toggle things and
throw that EDR tool in and be done.
Right. And we're like, no. This is daily maintenance.
Sure.
It's upkeep. It's
just the basics of changing passwords and applying patches is a large logistics undertaking for a big company.
Yes.
Right? When you have thousands of servers and tens of thousands of users, just that alone is something I don't think folks fully appreciate, that takes time and effort. Because let's just say you have 1,000 servers and you're 90% successul. There's still 100 vulnerable boxes.
Right.
And they're all not patching for a reason. So now a human has to go address that problem and then get them patched. And so, you invest a lot of money to be secure.
Right. And that's just one small segment of it. I mean, there's all kinds of other stuff that we run up, we run up against and playing. So Sentinel Blue, my company, we're a blue team. It's in the name. It's kind of why we named it that. But there's so many different areas you have to be good at, and things like patching. And now a lot of companies we go into, we have to revoke privileges because, as you said, a long time ago, someone made a decision like, hey, we want everyone in for convenience so that we can make sure things are happening. And one of the messages we have to start is, hey, we got to come in, we got to lock a lot down. We have to start revoking privileges. We have to say, hey, does this guy really need that privilege? We got to pull that back. And you make all this interruption. The businesses don't like it.
Yep.
And they're like, can you just do the security thing without impacting us? And we're like, no, we can't. It's by nature, this is impacting because it's so deeply ingrained. Technology is in everything you guys do now.
And that's the tough part. We had to pivot some years ago, right? Where security is viewed as the group of no.
Yes.
As opposed to, I'm a business enabler who is here to get you to success. I'm here to say yes and secure. And so to do that, it wasn't that we had to necessarily change the process. The things you said are things that still have to get done. But we switched to let me talk to everybody. Let me meet them where they're at.
Right.
And let me teach them the threat, not just the threat to energy or dominion, the threat to you in your home life. Let me make it personal for you, because it's much easier to meet everybody there than it is to meet everybody at their job, because they all have different needs there. But at home, we all use the internet. We all have email. We have social media. There's kids, et cetera. And so everybody's got a similar picture there. So it became really easy to meet them there and go, let me teach you how you're vulnerable, and let me teach you how you can secure you. Magically, those same principles apply in the workplace. And as you get sort of a critical mass within the organization of people going, now I understand the basics of security. Now you can have that conversation about, hey, that Chinese vendor that wants to sell you that widget, might not be your best choice, or that software program that wants to run as admin rights and be connected to the internet may be a risk we want to talk about. And how do we mitigate that?
Well, I like what you're doing over at Dominion, where you're having everyone come through for a tour, right? Because they're going to hear directly from you, who's playing and leading the blue team. Like, hey guys, here's the real threat. Like this right here, that is China trying to bring you down.
Yep. The SOC's done a really good job. They have a very beautiful board that actually every 15 seconds shows who's attacking from where. And so there's visuals on there that really make it sort of real for people of, we're not just making this up. It's not theoretical people are attacking us. Look right there. They're doing it right now. And this is how they're attacking you. And this is where they're coming from. And this is the kinds of things. So yeah, it's a lot of fun for people to see that because it just makes it a little more interesting. And besides, it's behind a locked door with fingerprint readers and stuff. So it's like you're seeing something Jason Bourne.
Yeah. They're like, ooh, we're going kind of cool. We're going deep. Yeah. So you mentioned that cybersecurity sort of has this reputation of being the group of no. And I think that's been a communication problem from our industry writ large. Yep. And I think we're getting better at it. I love the term of an enabler, right? We're more of an enabler. And before we started, filming the podcast, we were talking a bit about titles and CISOs. And you mentioned, an emerging term for this role is a chief resilience officer. Because maybe the concept is less about, just security, but we're ensuring resilience.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a misnomer when you say I have cybersecurity in that you've locked the door and nothing bad will ever happen. Now, obviously, practitioners are going to say, no, something will eventually happen. Right. But if you're a non-techie, the idea that I've paid for all this security, I have all these people, I put all these tools. As a matter of fact, I have a department called cybersecurity, I'm safe. No, you're never safe, as we already talked about. You have to pivot and change. But B, anywhere there's a wire, the bad guy now has a chance to get in. And eventually, given enough time, as your example earlier about 45 days brute forcing, they will get in. And so the real message is A, am I secure enough? Am I making the right decisions? I'm not frivolously wasting money. I'm being secure enough. But B, do I have the right resilience in place so that when there is something, I'm able to restore, react, contain the problem set quickly and efficiently. And so I think there's a much bigger focus these days on resilience at a board level, at a senior leader level, than there is about, hey, let's talk about cybersecurity. The questions they're asking while under the auspices of cybersecurity are really resilience questions. And how are you thinking about that problem set?
I love the concept of thinking of things as like a door. And I'd like to, anyone who thinks like this is an opening and shutting of doors, like there's no door. That's what the wire is, a hole through everything.
It's a legit hole.
Right. And all you're doing is routing things a bit more. You're basically stacking slices of Swiss cheese.
It's almost like you have a bouncer at the door checking IDs, but guess what? The fake ID still gets you through the door.
That's right. The door is effectively, if you want to shut the door, it's unplugging from the internet.
Yep.
But you don't want to do that.
I think only China and Russia have been the two governments that have unplugged their countries from the internet for a test. And frankly, I don't care if they did it right or not.
Yeah.
They're the main bad guys.
So, that opens a can of worms. I wonder, as we're clearly escalating in this cyber war we're in, I think the temptation for the American government to eventually institute some sort of great firewall-esque control plane is there. And I'm torn on that as a practitioner, as a blue teamer who sees the threat, sees the impact they can have on our livelihood, on our statehood. Our sovereignty can be, damaged by a cyber actor in a nation state. You kind of want that level of defense, but you also, as a private citizen, as a pro-privacy advocate, you don't really want to live in that scenario. But are we headed to, the death of the internet? These are big questions.
Sure.
But are we headed to a change where it's, instead of a massive global internet, are we now going to have nation-state controlled internets, and we're sort of back to square one? And the whole thing the internet was meant to solve has created the problem that killed it.
Yeah, it's an interesting problem set simply because the world is so integrated today that even little changes to the free and open internet are difficult for the public to absorb. A great example is, video game companies have the challenge of bad guys getting in, stealing people's accounts, cheating at the game, and making money off of it. So one way they thought, hey, we're going to solve this. We're going to have everybody just put their phone number in so we can verify that they're a real person with a real number.
Sure.
And you can't have a whole lot of accounts tied to the same number kind of thing. People rebelled. Wait, you want my phone number tied to my video game account? So that's a pretty minor security measure in the grand scheme of things, and probably not all that super effective in the long run. But yet people were hearing nothing of it. And so I think so much of the world is more or less a free economy, right? And governments with folks have a lot of freedoms, that I think that's difficult to do. And we're so integrated. I mean, you can see it now, politics aside, you can see it with the tariff discussions and how integrated supply chains are. Companies are integrated in much the same way for information sharing, collaboration, getting software products, patches and updates, that if that future plays out, it's not the next 5 or 10 years.
Right. We're talking like major global shift.
Yep.
And you'd like to think all of this is a cat that's not going back in a bag, right? And now we just have to adjust.
Yep. It seems tough. And I think the reality is we have to get better at cybersecurity, but at the end of the day, better at resilience. And just the bad day is going to happen. What are you going to do about it?
I'm going to bring back to Dominion because I'm curious. One of my favorite, if you can have a favorite cyber attack, one of the most interesting or fascinating for me is always Stuxnet.
Sure.
And what the Israelis and possibly the U.S. were involved in. I know no one can confirm nor deny that. But by way of a cyber attack, we brought down or greatly interrupted the Iranian ability to, I believe, enrich uranium.
Yep. And centrifuges. Yep.
Right. Yeah. So we had a kinetic impact we destroyed centrifuges through a cyber attack, and it was like an air-gapped attack. We crossed an air-gapped barrier to impact their operational technology. You mentioned early on when we were talking about, big companies like Dominion have learned over time, and you guys have taken a lot of that stuff off the big network, off the internet, and you have your own networks, but they're still networked.
They're still people.
Right.
So yeah, at the end of the day, I think insider threat, right, is a whole other aspect of security and resilience there. And it's an interesting challenge because these are assets that are essential to our way of life, essential to our government, deemed at the highest levels of criticality by the government, so much so that I get help from all those 3-letter agencies we've rattled off throughout this. They all participate in my cybersecurity, yet at the end of the day, we're still at risk because of the laws we have that are good laws, right? Title VII is a great law. You can't discriminate against people. Wonderful. But that also means in the hiring process, we're hiring the best and brightest candidates, the ones that interview the best and have the engineering skills. Not all of them are playing for Team America, but you can't look at them differently because they were sent over by their country, perhaps to collect information, perhaps to be pre-positioned. Perhaps they weren't sent at all by their country and they're just unfortunately associated because of that nationality. You can't look at any of that.
Right.
So you end up with the possibility that somewhere deep inside your teams of smart people, there's somebody with access that, to your point, could go do something bad, which is why you build a couple of things, right? You build lots of resilience in who can do what. So there isn't a person who can go flip all the switches. Or if you try to flip all the switches, there is literally programmatic things that stop you from doing that. So we built a lot of that stuff into the system now for one bad actor or 5 bad actors can't impact it to the way, the 0-day Netflix show, right, says it could be impacted. But number 2, you build programs that sort of watch behavior. And that's what you can watch is behavior. Hey, Sean today, he doesn't normally access nuclear files. Why the heck is he trying to do that? Let's go see. He doesn't normally get emails from people trying to email him from China or trying to ask him these questions. And so that you start seeing interesting behaviors. And if the behaviors are risky enough, now you can start digging into it more and you see that, that was Sean. And he was assigned to a project to do such and such with nuclear. That's okay. Or no, he wasn't. His boss said he should never be looking at nuclear stuff. Let's go understand that problem set more. And so you need programs like that are behavior based, but that are robust. They're not just surface level. Hey, Sean sent out a bunch of files. Who cares? It was only 30 meg. Yeah, but he did it 1,000 times, right? You need programs a little more robust and a little more in depth that understand that. There's tools for that. There's people for that. There's investigators for that. And so a number of utilities are now investing in that much more heavily. 5 years ago, that wasn't a thing, right? We had the infancy of a program. Nobody else did. Lockheed Martin did, right? The Defense Industrial Base did. They've been doing it for a long time. Lockheed Martin invented it, right? And the DIB has been doing it great for years, but utilities weren't. And so now that's shifted a great deal where the big ones now have programs of that nature.
That's exactly right. In the defense industry, counterintelligence has been a thing for a long time.
Sure.
Knowing that there are potential spies or, people trying to gain access and gain information and whatnot, you don't think of the energy sector as needing a counterintelligence sort of support, but I imagine there's a lot of counterintelligence interest from some of those agencies monitoring what's going on at the big energy producers because now we know that's a threat.
Yeah, we do get the occasional phone call, right, from one of those agencies of, hey, we think this might be of interest to you, and it's around the counterintelligence type of that information. So, yeah.
And it speaks to, so much of our conversation so far has been about the external perimeter and the nation states attacking and, hey, we're playing defense. Like we're talking about blue team. You can imagine we're on a front line. We're dug in our trench. They're in their trench. And occasionally they try to jump the line, right? Insider threat is just a whole other concern. It's guys in the bunker with us.
Yeah, and it's tough because human nature is such as to put people in buckets and categories and make generalizations. And the reality is that when you're dealing with these large workforces, is that 99.999% of everybody is really a great person.
Right.
And generalizations harm you because they perhaps point you in the wrong direction. And perhaps you're looking at the wrong kind of insider threat. What about the person who went to Vegas and lost everything and then got approached in court? What about the person going through a terrible divorce or a horrible health incident and they just don't have the money and they got approached? And so the point is you need a holistic view and you need it to be behavior-based. Otherwise, you actually end up doing yourself a disservice by using generalizations and sort of that societal kind of a lens to look at what you think a threat is.
These are big and esoteric problems for a workforce that most people think of hands-on keyboard, binary thinkers, coders, engineer types. A lot of the cybersecurity problem is a human problem.
It is.
And human skills might be the hardest skills to come by.
Yeah, when you think about resilience, right, the first line and last line of your defense is a human.
Right.
No matter how you line up what your defenses are.
Now, with AI.
Yeah, humans getting that email. And in the power sector, right, we generally don't do things like automate turning off your power, right? There's generally a human at the back end and a human at the front end that could have made a decision to affect that outcome. So yeah, humans are both an integral part, but also a potential weak link because especially in an industry like a power company, right? We are a service-oriented industry. Our job is to keep your lights on. We're out our linemen are in the rain and the snow and the cold and at night to do that work because that's what they believe in. That's a inherent human nature that says, I want to help.
Right.
And so you I don't want to say we're more susceptible, but that we train to hey, I understand your nature and your nature is awesome and that's why we are what we are. Be careful with those emails, right? Think about them a little bit differently. Be careful with the websites you go to and such. And so the human problem is an ever-changing challenge. Just because, like I said earlier, it's tough to meet everybody where they're at because everybody's thinking about things a little bit differently.
Yeah, we're human.
Yep.
It's very different. And I think it's worth saying the energy sector, those linemen, those people who are out there in the cold and the wet and all that, maybe a bit of a thankless job. Like the whole sector, it's kind of taken for granted. Oh, yeah. And what's the first thing that happens when my power goes out? It's like,
you'd be amazed how crazy people get. And I understand, right? You lose power and it starts as an annoyance.
Right.
And it rapidly moves into a life impacting thing. And those crews in the field, they take some harassment, they take some angry words, they take dealing with difficult customers who, sometimes they don't understand, sir, ma'am, I'm actually restoring your power right now. No, I live way over there. No, sir, ma'am, this is the problem that is for your whole neighborhood and I'm taking care of it for you. And you're in essence pulling crews away from their job. And yeah, they deal with a very difficult situation.
There's a lot of areas of our modern life I feel like don't get the accolades that maybe are deserved. We had on the podcast several episodes ago, Joyce Hunter, who spent a career with the Department of Agriculture. And we had a great conversation and it just really opened my eyes and made me think a lot more about, the food that you take for granted shows up in the grocery store, but there is a legion of people who are well-intentioned, working in frustrating, sometimes thankless roles to make sure that happens. And the energy sector, I imagine, is very much the same. I take for granted that electricity powers my home right now.
Right.
I don't think about there's a security operations center of cyber defenders who are being attacked daily and having to do all the things that you're doing.
And not just that, there's operations centers watching the grid. They're watching, lines that are being taken out for service, but lines that are down because the drunk driver ran into the pole and equipment has broken and a storm has rolled through. And yeah, there's a lot of those kinds of roles in the energy sector that you don't think about. You just think I flipped the switch and there's electrons. Those electrons that are powering that light were put on that line right now. Right. They're not sitting out there waiting for you to turn the switch on. There's somebody that's balancing all that. And the amount of electrons we consume need to equal the amount of electrons we created. They don't just float around and wait for somebody to need them. So there's a very complicated, I said earlier, it's the world's largest machine is what I hear a lot when I talk to our engineers. At the end of the day, it really is a complex thing. It takes a lot of people doing jobs that nobody understands, even to the point of we have biologists, for example. Why would the energy company have biologists? Well, we want to make sure that there's no things we do don't create runoff or spillage or have any impact on the environment whatsoever. And so we have biologists that work for us full time, and there's accountants, and there's doctors and nurses, and there's a whole variety of folks that work in large power companies that I think the average person doesn't. It's just that lineman in the truck, right? No, they're an integral part. They are thousands of our workforce, but there are folks that support them doing just about every other job.
There's a lot of temptation for me here to get on a soapbox, and I'm gonna lean into it for just a second. One of the recurring conversations we have is we have people who represent institutions very often on our show, and there's a growing skepticism around institutions, around large, what are seen as monolithic organizations, and they're very easy to criticize. When your power is out, it's very easy to be like, Dominion, what are you guys doing over there? Right. And there's no thought to all these people who are doing things like biologists who are making sure that how we produce our energy is not destroying the local environment by creating, chemical runoff and things of this nature. It's very easy to forget how many well-intentioned, good faith, as you said, like the 99.999% of people involved are just trying to do a good job. They have that helpful nature. That's what they're out there to try to do. And, there's this growing cynicism. We're into some big topics today. I wasn't really planning on this getting so philosophical.
Not quite cyber topics, but yeah.
But, there's this growing cynicism, I think, that I find concerning, that we're so quick to see nefariousness in what people are trying to do. And we're so quick to criticize like a whole sector of people or a whole institution, when really it's just people trying to make sure there's power to your home, man.
They are. I have to remind myself sometimes, because I'll see myself, almost pointing that finger at another company. And when I think back to the Dominion analog, our senior leadership, right, espouses the value, for example, of ethics. We will not make a decision that is not ethical. We will not do the wrong thing. We do the right thing, even when it comes out of our profits, so to speak, all the time. My cyber budget comes out of our profits. Right. We don't charge the ratepayer to do cybersecurity. We charge ourselves to do cybersecurity, and we invest what we need to invest to do it right. And it's just a great example of, and I see, Amazon could have done better, but are they already doing great? There's already a legion of people out there. I don't know. So I give them the benefit of the doubt, because when I look internally, I go, no, we did the right thing. We made the right decisions. I'm sorry that went out. We're going to fix it for you, kind of thing. But yeah, I see what you're talking about, where it's very easy to have a news article pop up and just assume the big bad corporation is out for the big bad corporation. But when you're on the inside of that, especially when you have senior leadership that is very visible to employees and is very vocal about our core values, and then makes decisions that align with those, it's a little bit easier to give other companies some slack when you see it in your own company.
That all sounds like a generally resounding success for that industry, for the top decision makers in your company to be thinking about being ethical, to do things like employ biologists to make sure that the environmental impact is minimized, to make sure, like, there's so many things in the resilience you guys have built to make sure power continues, to our homes, to our lives.
Yeah, power company is a very complicated beast, right? Of roles you would never expect.
So my question to you is how much of that is due to the highly regulated nature of utilities?
I think some of it is. I think you certainly will call it the benefit to the general public of having rules that even if you had big bad leadership, that they would still be somewhat constrained by those rules. But the reality is regulation will never be sufficient to solve any problem. Like I use cyber regulation. It's slow, it's antiquated, threats change by the second, regulations change by the year. So at the end of the day, I think a lot of that goes to the culture of the people. So when I first came out of college, I went to Anderson Consulting, which doesn't exist anymore. But it was a segment of Arthur Anderson on K Street. And it was all about, the quick hit projects around different companies, like a typical consulting company, right? I would go in real quick. I'd have me do something, and they send me out. Well, my fourth project, I ended up at Dominion Energy. I stayed because of the culture, and I've been there for the 30 years since. And the culture with the people there is just simply a service culture, right? It's we are going to be out in that snowstorm. And multiple times in my career, I've been standing in a parking lot with a blizzard, doing that mutual aid, marshaling the trucks to where they need to park and pointing them to the food and the hotels and everything else, or driving the pickup truck while the real smart engineer is doing damage assessment to get folks out to restore the power. I'm the person driving him to keep him safe so he doesn't have to do both or stop or anything else. Point is it is a service culture, and the IT geek pitches in. I don't want to say just as much, not anywhere near as much, but the IT geeks and the support staff pitch in and support the folks in the field because our mission is keep those lights on. And I think that's exemplified at the top. And so my point to your question is, yes, regulations help, I think, in the perspective of keeping you oriented towards some of those, but completely insufficient. If you don't have leadership that believes in that same service culture, it doesn't matter at the end.
Use the word that came to mind for me as you're talking about it as mission, right? It sounds like everyone's bought into the mission, and it's a clear mission. It's an understood mission.
Yeah, utility companies are insane with it in terms of the number of people that stay 30, 40 plus years. I just had a friend of mine retire at 42 years. You know, when I was a young kid out of college, the idea of even being 42 years old, right, was old, much less 42 years at a company.
Yeah.
And so I think you stay because of the mission. You stay because of the people that believe in the same mission, that have the same value system that you do. And utilities tend to have folks that stay an incredibly long amount of time.
So as a defender, as a blue teamer, I assume you're not a red teamer necessarily.
I have a red team.
Okay. Yeah. Sure. There's a lot of emerging technology right now. AI is, of course, the big dominant thing. And we talk a little bit about quantum and how quantum, encryption may change things and all that. But I think AI is sort of the big dominant talk right now, and what it may enable bad actors to do, compound their ability to attack, maybe make them more sophisticated with time. Is that your read on AI? I mean, do you have a growing concern about it?
I mean, it's a tool, and it's a tool that's being exploited. But it hasn't been a fundamental game changer. What I'm seeing two things that have really shifted in the past year. Number one, you're seeing North Korea and Iran become much more capable because guess what? Russia's paying them in for the weapons that they're getting. And nobody wants a ruble, but they'll take cyber capability. And then number two, you're seeing criminal groups. I think one of the articles I recently read said there were no new ransomware variants through December of last year for like the previous 12 or 18 months. But there were a ton of new criminal groups and a lot more alliances between groups and cooperation that were enabled by AI. So I think AI is a force multiplier because the kid in his mom's basement can do badness easier than he could before. And, I think a lot of people like to think of, criminal groups as the kid in their mom's basement. No, these are really smart people. These are people that have degrees and coordination and leadership structures. They're not dumb by any means. This is a force multiplier for already smart people, already organized people. And you see it play out. We've seen it play out. Phishing is just an easy example because people can relate to it. You see it play out in phishing where you might get a phishing email today from the bad actor that says, "Hey, Andy, I know you went to the Bahamas recently, and I just want to." And I might get one that says, "Hey, Sean, I know you were at Chick-fil-A yesterday, and we got a new coupon for you." Completely different emails from the same threat actor, leading back to the same exploit on the back end. They were both created within a second or two of each other because they threw it into their AI brain. They had their dump of data off the dark web that talked about your Bahamas vacation and my love of Chick-fil-A and put them together into an attack. And so it becomes that kind of force multiplier instead of us both getting the Nigerian prince, right? Or the same generic email. And so I'm seeing that change.
I never
play
did
out
get
a
my
lot.
money from that one. I never sent it.
Never sent your $10 million? No, I'm sorry.
Maybe we wouldn't.
Tell you what, if you give me $3,000, I will assist you.
We'll talk after the show. I don't want to do that transaction live on the camera here. But so AI as an emerging threat, are there any other emerging threats maybe specific to the energy sector?
I mean, I think other than understanding that, hey, China's got badness out there, right? I mean, you got Volt Typhoon targeting this. You got Salt Typhoon, right, targeting the telecom sector. And while I mentioned earlier, some of the big utilities, all of our communications that make and move energy are internal. That's not true for all utilities. Many utilities need the backhaul of Verizon, AT&T, et cetera, which are, again, wonderful companies with really robust security practices, but being heavily targeted by Salt Typhoon. So at the end of the day, it's groups like that emerging that we have to watch out for because it is China increasing the number of dedicated attack teams at different sectors that all stitch together to ultimately make the critical infrastructure of the United States work. And so that's been a big threat lately.
But we've talked a little bit about Russia and Ukraine. Any major lessons that the energy sector is taking out of that conflict?
I mean, I think there's a lot of discussions around sort of grid resiliency. You learn a lot from, hey, this thing blew up and this thing crashed. You learn a lot from supply chain, right? Both supply chain being impacted by the conflict, but also the current state of the supply chain in terms of what happens if, right? How many of these widgets do I need to store? Because again, it's a for-profit shareholder-owned company. So you're not storing a spare nuclear reactor, right? If that was even a thing you could store. But how many widgets do you store in the event of a disaster to have enough resilience? And does a conflict like the damage that can happen in Russia, Ukraine even play into that? And so, yeah, the engineers study that those impacts and those lessons. And then we studied lots of lessons. Like you studied years ago it was Fukushima, right? And the tidal wave hitting a nuclear plant. And so as an industry, we are very, very good about both consuming data, but also sharing data. There was, stories about, well, what if there's a Bitcoin farm and a whole bunch of them and you flip the power on and off? Can you destabilize? We study everything. Right? If there's a theory out there, we will study it, we will share it, we will collaborate as an industry. And like you said, we're talking mutual aid, right? That's a factor too, because if the western part of the U.S. is in trouble, but the eastern part is good, there is aid we can send and help and bring the grid back up. So yeah, we study the machine a lot and worry about resilience a lot. Hence, resilience officer, I think, is a direction that folks are going, whether a formal title or whether an expectation of the role.
On the mutual aid topic, maybe not so much to the other large organizations where you have these existing relationships and agreements, but bring it back down to these small, solar farms and whatnot that are coming online, who, as you mentioned, are like, hey, we're just throwing a router in, we're on the internet, we're good to go. What should they be doing? Like, if you could reach them, I'm sure you do in your role, but if you could reach them, that audience, what would you tell them to start doing?
First thing I tell them is stop making the excuse that cyber is expensive, because that's typically when you walk into, a delegate's office or a senator's office and you're having a conversation and they've just met with the solar lobby. Well, it's expensive and my site is small. A, not expensive, and B, it's not about your site, it's about the aggregate. So A, let's discuss the overall threat. And then B, here's how you can do it for cheap. Right? Microsoft Defender is an antivirus. Just run it instead of disabling it. Changing passwords, solar sites are an interesting thing. Generally, somebody turns them off at night and turns them back on in the morning. That's generally how they work. Well, you already have Joe Schmo doing that.
Okay.
Then Joe Schmo can change your passwords once every 90 days. You don't really pay two Joe Schmoes now. You're just having Joe Schmo take on another task to do it for you. And so a lot of things you can do in cyber are pretty cheap. So we have actually internally to Dominion, when you mentioned regulation earlier, we have our own standard, right, that everything complies with, whether it's regulated or not. And our internal standard. Everything must comply. So when something new is built, it complies on day one. Everything else was retrofitted. The board is aware of that standard. It's their expectation. And that standard, we build it to a large company scale, right? So I might use a different Palo Alto firewall than you need to use at a solar site, right? They're completely different. Point is you can do it for cheap. You can buy a $2,000 Palo Alto firewall. Now you're not sitting on a Comcast modem on the internet. Now you're at least behind a firewall. You can change your passwords. You can apply antivirus. You can make sure you're not running on Windows 7. But you can get to Windows 11 if you're going to have a desktop or to a supported server version. And so it's those kinds of things that it's almost a set it and forget it in the solar space that we estimated out that you can spend less than $10,000 for a solar site to get it cyber secure. And an interesting comparison point is those large panels you see, one of them is $10,000. How many hundreds do you see in a field?
Right.
I just need to spend one panel to get secure. And so the cost isn't really an issue. The time isn't really an issue. I think it's more I don't want anybody else telling me what to do in my space kind of an issue, which is where I think, if Governor Youngkin puts this bill forward, I know North Carolina is looking at one, South Carolina is looking at one. I think as more states start thinking about the problem, I think we'll start seeing movement there.
We have in the defense industry a new regulatory sort of pressure to have defense companies, defense contractors improve their security. They've been on the books for the last 7+ years to need to put the standard into place, but they haven't really done it.
Is this the CMMC?
It's exactly that. So they haven't really done it. Now there's this third-party audit framework through CMMC and whatnot. And one of the big pushbacks from smalls in the defense industry is like, hey, this is wildly expensive. We don't have the means for it. On some level, I hear where they're coming from. I get it. That's primarily the customer base I support as I work with small businesses. But I think sometimes there's an overestimation of the cost. There's an underestimation of the value that resilience creates, of eliminating things like vulnerability. There's like survivorship bias that certain small businesses haven't been hit yet. And they're like, but why would we need to spend this money that we've never had to spend before? I think it's an important message that it's not as expensive as you think. You can do a lot.
Even with NIST 171 that CMC is based on, it's 110-ish controls.
Yeah,
many of them are quick and dirty. There are a few. You got to have multi-factor authentication. Okay, you're going to invest in. So don't be SMS. Okay, so I'm going to buy a RSA or an Okta or a Duo token or a Google token. Okay, there's an expense there, but at the end of the day, it's not a big expense, especially for a small company. So
a lot of it's very doable.
Yep. And doable with like a firm like yours, right? Working with a third party. You don't have to have the staff in-house to do that as a small company. There are firms that will support you.
Yeah, I mean, we have the conversation regularly with small businesses, not to get on my sales. I'm getting on soapboxes a lot, but we bring a capability, and there's lots of companies like Sentinel Blue. We're not wildly unique, but smalls may look at that list of the 110 things they have to do, and there is some, there's some cybersecurity tradecraft in there of, hey, you have to learn how to do risk management, you have to do security control, continuous monitoring, a lot of process work, but also security configuration. And they look at it and like, this is too much. I'm just and what they've been doing is being like, this is too much. I've got to get parts out the door. I'm setting this off to the side. I'll deal with it later. You don't have to, it doesn't have to be build a cybersecurity team. It can be work with a partner, find a partner who can bring all that. And they can often do it for lower cost than a salary of someone to even attempt those things. But
certainly given where we're located, right, with the proximity of DC, lots of conversations with sort of inside the Beltway, companies of various types, whether it's defense or whether it's government partners, all of which have to be CMMC compliant. And I think the big lesson they're taking from it is twofold. One is there are partners to help. And number two is there are partners to train my folks. And once they understand it, it's actually not all that tough. It's a lack of understanding, the scariness of, in essence, a risk register or a risk. What does that mean? How do I do one of those?
Right. It feels esoteric.
It can be a spreadsheet.
Right.
And we all know what spreadsheets are. Yep. So at the end of the day, there's solvable problems out there that aren't that expensive.
One of my main bones that I pick with my own industry, the cybersecurity industry, specifically in the CMMC world, that's where I've been the last 7-8 years, is we overcomplicate it. And I think we make things seem much scarier to the business leaders than we should. Like, there's a lot of people I know, we're all experts. We've been studying this stuff for 7 years and we communicate that way. A lot of us do. And we create expectations like, hey, your system security plan needs to be this 40,000 word document that's pages long for each control that addresses every specific scenario. And you go to this great depth. You communicate that. And again, people who aren't into this stuff, who don't understand, are going to look at it and be like, what are you guys talking about?
It kind of reminds me of the early days of IT. So like 30 years ago when everybody was a black box. You didn't want the network guy, didn't want you to know what happened in his box, and the database administrator didn't want you to know what happened in her box, and on down the line. Cyber can be that way these days, where it's the scary Wild West. And in order to get money and not have your budget cut and to convince people you're important, you almost want it to be scary. Is the perception I see when I talk to other companies. I found the opposite. The more transparent you get, the more you open that black box, actually the more support you get.
Yes. I learned that lesson early in my transition. I started out as an IT help desk, sort of worked my way up into IT engineering. And my first real transition to cybersecurity and into leadership was with a board of directors led organization. It was my first time interacting with a board that had some intimidating figures in it, generals with multiple stars on their shoulders, that kind of thing. And I had seen someone else do a briefing on cybersecurity and kind of painted the picture of like, hey, this is all bad. We need budget. It's scary. The sky is falling. And they were like, get out of here.
Right.
And I went in with some guidance from someone, an advisor, who was like, maybe your message should be more of a, hey, we recognize there's a threat, but here's what we're doing to address it. Here's what we've done. Here's the progress we made. And here's my plan to continue to make progress. Kind of went in with that. And they were like, yeah, that's all we wanted to hear. We didn't want to hear the sky is falling and you need unlimited budget. We need to hear, what is the real threat? What's the risk? What have we calculated as the risk? Where do we need to spend our time and attention? And what's your plan for it? That was a very valuable lesson for me in learning how to communicate. What is kind of true that cybersecurity, we have a lot of issues to solve. We need a lot of resourcing, but you don't need to go in with that message.
I think as boards are getting more sophisticated these days too, especially with the SEC rules around sort of board culpability, right? In the event that there's a badness that happens in cyber that they should have addressed. I think that message is the baseline message now, that now you add the layer to it of, we, the cyber team, understand the business imperatives, the business goals, and here's how we will support them to get to yes, right? And here's how we add value to that process is sort of the new layer on that message I think that we're seeing today. If you just go in with, I must solve all these problems, great, but how are you going to keep my new widget safe, my new product safe, my new location safe? How are you going to help me get to yes? And so that becomes part of the new paradigm.
It's good that that adjustment's happening.
Yep.
For a long time, I think we've just been seen as the cost center.
And I don't think it does in every boardroom. I think there are plenty of, I talked to plenty of peers who are like, man, it's a real pain to have to go present to my senior leadership and my board. And I think at the end of the day, their message is really around, let me show you a bunch of numbers. let me tell you the sky is falling, and let me tell you what I need more from you, as opposed to, no, I'm integrated with the business. We are part of that process. Cyber is just a component to get us to success.
It's a small nuanced sort of twist on the conversation, but it seems to have a deep impact.
Absolutely.
It can get them bought in.
It does. And I think that's key. I think the biggest challenge with somebody in the CISO role, whatever you want to, whatever, however you want to pronounce
CISO,
that. CISO, whatever. In that role is that you need somebody in that role that is very technical, that can go sit with the engineer or the IT geek in a room and go, that design's not going to work, or this is the thing we need. But you have to be able to pivot, and it's an entirely different skill set to go into a boardroom or into a senior leader's office and say, sir or ma'am, let's have this discussion about business direction, business goals, and how cyber enables you to get there securely. Those two skill sets aren't something that everybody has. A lot of your really smart CISOs rose up through the IT ranks and are super technically smart, or the opposite side. A lot of your boardroom CISOs were not IT geeks. And so they lack the credibility with the frontline teams, but yet can speak board language. And it's tough to find that mix in between of somebody who can speak geek, speak board, and navigate between the two.
It's a bit of a unicorn.
It is. It's tough. I mean, I was on a call last night with a buddy of mine from another company, and we were kind of rattling off a list of the folks we knew that kind of split into those two buckets because he was looking to talk to somebody. And we're like, well, out of these 20 some odd people we know, here's the 5 that I think really do well in that balance.
Yeah, it's a small group, and people who are really talented in the cyberspace and in IT generally, I have found can also often be dismissive of the other skill sets, and there's sort of like not a ranking or seniority, but there are sometimes the more technical prowess you possess, there's a feeling like that's who should be at the top of the food chain. It causes a lot of frustration for people when they find out that's not how the food chain operates beyond a certain point.
Right. Once
you get to the point you have leadership and you have to report to senior leadership and to boards, you really need someone who has the soft skills.
You do. The relationships are critical. I think that's what a lot of folks don't realize in cyber leadership is, while in my particular role, technically on paper, I have the authority to make people do what I write down. You will do this kind of patching. That's never going to work.
Right.
Because especially in a critical infrastructure space, you're dealing with turbo smart engineers. And like I mentioned earlier, they've been around for decades. So they are the smartest person in the room for their system. And you want to walk in and tell them what to do? Even if they have to comply, they're not going to comply willingly or to the degree that you need them to. And you're always going to be finding mistakes.
Yeah.
You have to be able to go in and say, hey, let me walk a mile in your shoes. Let me understand your business problem. Let's figure out a way to do that securely, and almost get to the point of them suggesting to you, hey, should we be doing this? Or, hey, I understand where that's coming from. Do you think we need that here? At that point, then you've won, right? Now you're their partner. Now you're sitting in the room with them as a peer, not as a demanding group that says no.
Right. For a group that's already got a streak of rebelliousness to them,
oh yeah,
I think a lot of people get into the IT industry because it's got sort of a rebellious streak to it, to come in and play the authoritarian, the corporate authoritarian of, hey, this is the rule and you're going to follow it and do it my way. It's not going to be
That's
successful.
why I think you see in a lot of companies today, an increasing number of companies today, cyber and IT are not the same thing. They're distinct skill sets, right? There is that IT Active Directory admin who is incredibly skilled at that, and that firewall admin and that server admin, and they're a separate silo under the CIO. And you have your CISO either reporting to a chief security officer or a chief legal officer, that kind of tower in the service company. So they're peer orgs. Cyber says what, IT says how, and then cyber gets to go, yep, that met the objective or not. And so you get a little bit of that healthy tension there where I'm going with that is you can build the talent within the cyber group of that collaboration, relationship building, walking a mile in your shoes, but still let the incredibly smart IT folks be the best at what they do, and their focus is that one little sliver. They don't have to sort of worry about the soft skill side as much.
Do you think those silos need to integrate? Like, should they remain separate silos, or are we getting to a point where IT and security need to be, more meshed?
I think it depends on your organization. And I can use ours as an example. Our CIO is an incredibly involved person, right? He understands cybersecurity really, really well. He's super easy to approach. So he ensures and he drives it down through his organization, and they know, thou shalt do the following, cyber commandments kind of thing. And so it very much functions like the orgs overlap, but they have distinctly different mission sets, right? IT's mission set is speed to market. It's user experience. It's keeping systems up. Security is a component, but unless driven from the top is not the primary or even a major component in many shops. Whereas cyber, keep it secure. Well, to your point out, the most secure thing in the world is pull the wire. Right. That'd be a really dumb business decision. Right. And so having them separate with a little yin and yang and a little conversation around how do you get to the right goal is somewhat helpful too. So,
right, so you got to stay closely integrated.
Very closely integrated. You have to have open conversations. You know, the phone needs to ring and need to be on a first name basis. And it needs to be, I can't believe that guy called. No, it needs to be, I'm so glad I'm talking to him. You know, the CIO, I actually worked for him at one point in my career, and he made a point to me at one point around, at a certain point in his career, his whole job was to stay out of his boss's office. And that triggered at that one job where the now was to get in front of them. It's the same concept here. My job is to get in front of people in their offices, where they're living, where they're working, and have those conversations, not wait for that phone call and go, oh my God, I can't believe they called me. So if you're doing cyber right, you're not the reactive call. You're upfront, proactive before that thing has even been, the vendor's been picked, it's been paid for, but no. We're weaving cyber into the conversation, and it's just part of the DNA. And that takes years. It's taken me 6.5 years to get to where we are today. And we'll spend years more continuing to build out on that. But now I sit way up front in those conversations, and I think it avoids those pitfalls of cyber's the group of no, or, hey, we bought this widget. It's from China. You can't use it. Kind of conversations. And it's much more of a cyber's here to help, and nobody laughs because we really are here to help, and they know that's part of the process.
I can imagine that's a lot of goodwill to have to earn.
Is a lot of goodwill. And you spend a good portion of the day not being technical and instead being a relationship person. And
you piqued my interest with a bit of tradecraft here. You mentioned you guys have your own internal standard.
We do.
For how things should be done. Can you maybe, I don't know if you want to share specifics, but is it built on anything, any particular framework? Like what are you trying to accomplish with yours?
We inherently as an industry live under NERC. But NERC is inherently based on NIST 171 or 853, which really are kind of globally under CSF, right? So I would say you could take any of those. You could take ISO 27001, you could take the SOX rules, you could take the TSA guidelines, you could take DoD 8500 or 8510. All of those have a whole lot of overlap shared components. What we've kind of done is because we're under all those regulations, right? The utility space is very heavily regulated. We kind of took the best of what we thought was sort of either the high water mark or the right best sort of mid, through line through all those standards, and then built out, it's 41 lines of things we want to do. And it's everything from, hey, you shall not connect those systems that make and move energy to the internet, to, hey, we're going to have a firewall, we're going to do this kind of rule review, and we're going to have this kind of a process around it, and boil it down. So it's largely based, I think everything's largely based on NIST and those kinds of frameworks. But
do you iterate that framework often?
We do. So there's a dedicated team of engineers. So one of the decisions we made early on was, I mentioned the engineer is that smartest person in the room. Well, I happen to be an engineer, which happens to give me at least a little credibility when I go talk to them, but a lot more credibility if I took a person from a power plant, from a nuclear plant, from the electric transmission or distribution, and brought them in and said, let me teach you cyber. Now you folks are the evangelists going. So we have a team of those folks. They own the standard. They have worked with these people for decades, and they go back out and work with the groups and do that. But yeah, cyber of today, not good enough for tomorrow is another of our little phrases that we use a lot. And so yeah, everything has to iterate, whether it's use cases in the SOC or your cyber standard. Like there was no line in there about AI 2 years ago, because at that point nobody knew what ChatGPT was, and all of a sudden it appeared in like October, November 2 years ago. So there's definitely an AI component to the standard now.
Which is probably a wiser way to manage standards. I talk about the defense industry and CMMC. It's built on this regulation that was written, not regulation, the standard 800-171.
Yep.
The current revision that the DoD is pushing was written in like 2015.
Right.
It's not addressing a lot of the existing threats, and it's over addressing things that we really don't need to pay that much attention to now. One of the great frustrations people express with regulation in general is we're in an industry that every 6 months revolutionizes in some capacity.
Oh, yeah.
And you're legislating 5 years of history here. That's maybe not the wisest approach as to yours, which is like, hey, we're going to set a standard. We're going to try to pull all these together, but we are going to iterate. And
it's a tough balance, because I think with cyber changing so rapidly, you could change a standard on probably a weekly basis in some form or fashion,
easily,
which would then drive change and cost to the business for limited value. Right. So we do sort of limit how we do it in terms of grouping things up, or is this a significant enough thing to be in sort of our baseline standard? But yeah, I think the ability to kind of regulate yourself and have your own standard that has support from the top of the company on down is just an expectation. Everybody will do this. And then a measure against it is much more effective than a standard that changes over years. The challenge you get, though, I think, is that not every company has a leadership structure that says, no, we're going to do the right thing, right? Yeah. Ethics is one of our, it's ethics and safety.
I'd say
that's number one.
To the rule.
Yeah, if you don't have that kind of leadership, it's tough. And then to your question earlier, that's where regulation really comes into matter. When you don't have that kind of leadership that says do the right thing, you need the regulation to push you in that direction. Unfortunately, CMMC is scary. It can be a pain if you're doing it wrong and you don't have the right group to teach it to you. But it's also a useful tool for those who aren't doing the right thing.
Yeah, no, I often equate it to a Trojan horse. I mean, it's a great way for me to enter into a company that needs to build resilience, build cybersecurity capability and resilience. Here is the mandated things that you need to do, but we can use that as an easy pivot to here's the other good things that you're going to want to do. Mm-hmm. It starts the conversation where they might otherwise have continued to not have the conversation. Sure. So it can be useful in that front. I find, CMMC, NIST 171 as a standard can be a little ill-fitting because they're trying to apply it to Lockheed Martin.
Yep.
But they're also trying to apply it to the 15-person manufacturing shop that carves a specific plate that goes onto a platform that Lockheed Martin eventually puts together.
Right.
It can feel a little, brute forced or a little bit of a square peg. And
that's why sort of in ours, right, an equivalence conversation to that would be in my standard, I actually have tiers across the top. So if you're effectively at that tier of the plate, then the level of work you're doing to patch or to do this is either less frequent or less often or et cetera, that you need to tier it based on risk.
I think that'd be a wiser approach. I feel like ours is a little dull edged sort of, it's just not as precise as I feel like we need it to be, but it's a starting point and it's having impact. It's definitely getting companies to move.
If you want zero risk, then just unplug your computers.
That's
but
right.
We're not. We're a risk-based society. We're profit companies. So at the end of the day, you have to have a risk-based approach.
So one of our great challenges in cybersecurity is workforce. Mm-hmm. And we hear about this a lot about shortage, but you also hear about, people having great difficulty finding jobs. Mm-hmm. There's just a large conversation around workforce, around diversity, about who's coming in. What's your take on, the workforce and what we're doing to address it?
So I certainly would agree there is a shortage. I think the numbers are somewhere between 750,000 and 1 million empty jobs here in the U.S., 2.5 to 3 million worldwide in the cyberspace. Most of those, though, when you stripe them across the sort of skill sets, are in that person who's been there 6 years to 20 years skill set range. So you're missing the unicorns, right? Who are not antisocial, who can build relationships, who aren't just going to hide in their corner and tell everybody to do it my way, and they're on the market. Because many of the ones on the market, go back 3 weeks ago, many of the ones on the market 3 weeks ago probably weren't that. There's a fair number on the market right now who are leaving government, who, for their own choice or not, who will help fill some of those gaps, but far, far, far too few. I mean, if CISA's downsized 100 people and there's 1 million open jobs, well,
It's not even a drop in the bucket.
6 years ago or so, right, we sort of saw that problem set coming. And I had some senior folks that they still are rock stars, but we moved the rock stars into other roles. How do I backfill that rock star? I need to go find and hire one. And we couldn't. We couldn't find that right person on the market. And we still to this day have great trouble doing that unless we see that retiring FBI analyst or agent or that CISA person going, right? Or cyber brigade or the National Guard, right? We get lucky and we grab those folks on a somewhat frequent basis, but not enough to keep up with sort of the demand of 6 years ago. And so we switched and we said, we're going to do a couple of things. Number one, we're going to focus on retaining talent. How do I get a training budget that keeps these folks' skills current? How do I make them have a mission focus? And how do I make sure they understand they are part of a team and that they matter? So we put a lot of effort into that. And that's culminated to zero turnover in the past 2 years.
Wow.
But then the other big leap of faith we took was, all right, I've got some openings 6 years ago. I'm not going to fill them with senior folks. I'm going to hire the kid out of college. And we're going to build that. We're going to use that training money and we're going to build that plan. So we have a 10-year plan now. And every year there's a series of classes you get, assignments you get, stretch goals you get, and you progress through that in your career. So now we're 6 years into that. Now I've got just turbo smart kids of 6 years ago who are now senior type folks. and are now leading the training of the newest. And I've got the 10-year, the 15-year, the 20-year folks as well. But the point is, you now built a pipeline. That's a risk, but it's a risk that if you can do it for 5 or 6 years, you've now built a pipeline. And I think that helps you with your talent pool, because what I'm not finding is trouble with kids out of college applying for jobs. I'm getting 250, 300 people for one job. Everybody wants to be in cyber. Now, they're not all qualified to be in cyber. Cyber is just the hot word right now. Yep. But I'm still able to find that rock star young person just out of college with some sort of degree that lets them fit into that space. It doesn't have to be computer science or cybersecurity, but something that fits in that space. And then we invest in them. And we do things like on day one, I stole this from all my buddies in the video game industry. On day one, they get their swag, they get their mug or their lunchbox and you get a whole bunch of swag on your desk on day one, just to say, hey, we appreciate you. This is our branding and this is our mission. And let's start it on day one. Hey, you get a mentor on day one. So we're going to help you out with your career right there on day one, and on down the line from there. We have a whole series of activities we do to make sure people know mission, team, and that we are investing in you.
I think that's super important, the investment in them. But you're right; it's a risk.
It's a risk
in this industry. It's something of a factoid that gets spread around. Like the best way to maximize your earnings in a career in IT is to change jobs every 2 years.
Yep.
And that, as an employer, leads to a bit of skepticism. Sometimes you're like, do I really want to apprentice somebody and basically make them a superstar for someone else eventually? Right. And so you have some, I think, probably bad thinking there.
Well, you certainly want to pay them well, and you certainly want to move them forward in their career at a reasonable pace. But I also think what helps us a little bit in that too is that mentoring aspect there. Like I remember when I was young in my career, the idea of going into my equivalent's office back then, whoever that was, and having a sit down to talk about my career was a non-starter. I didn't want to go see my manager, and boy, that was tough to do at the time, to even go see the manager. I have a rotating group of people that the managers have said these folks could benefit from having a conversation. And that conversation maybe about how does the company work? How does my career work? Hey, I've got these weird problems going on. But the point is making leaders available at a variety of levels, I think helps with that from the perspective of, hey, you do have a future. Hey, here is a reasonable expectation. Here is a path forward. Here's a stretch assignment we can give you. Here's a way to set your expectations appropriately, kind of thing. Just having that open, honest conversation, I think I know when I was early in my career, first of all, I couldn't have told you who the CIO was early in my career, nor did I care at that level. And I definitely couldn't have told you that they cared about me or wanted me to go anywhere. And so I think just having that conversation and that relationship lets folks know there is a path. We are looking out for you. We do value you. We are investing a great amount in you. And we do want you to succeed and stay here, ideally.
Yeah, I imagine that works. I mean, you talk about a pipeline. You're 6 years into it. The risk that you address or that you think about when you're starting that is like, man, how many of these people are really going to see this through? I imagine it's been pretty successful. It's
been very successful. I mean, you certainly have the occasion where somebody will go, but it's rare. And the team, I compare this team to when I started and teams I've been at along the way. It's wonderful to see they gel into a big group. For example, every Thursday morning we get together in a conference room. I bring in breakfast sandwiches and they just talk. And it's all those, you mentioned earlier about silos and combining silos. It's all the silos within cyber that on a day-to-day basis wouldn't have to talk. Right. And therefore, if you do that over years, they never will talk and they'll grow apart. But if every Thursday they get together and, hey, you're the pickleball champion, and hey, I saw this new movie, and hey, you're going on vacation over here to Japan, we just had somebody come back from, those all become the culture and they become the conversations, the expert. It's nothing to do with cyber. Right. It has to do with Thursday morning, we all get together and break bread and have a great conversation.
Comes back to that humanity.
It does.
People of it all.
And it matters at the end. And so a lot of times when I talk about cyber and I talk about resilience, and I mentioned earlier, humans were the first and last line of defense there. The human problem is the problem to solve. Anybody can buy a tool. Anybody can hire a consultant. Anybody can write a procedure. Anybody can patch a server. The human problem is the one, if you focus on that, everything else just takes care of itself. And so that was a big switch for us. Again, not that we're a human company, right? We're a service company, but IT geeks don't tend to think about humans. We tend to think about server administrators and firewall people, not the humans behind them. And so our shift back then was, no, our focus is on the human. The job will take care of itself if we focus on the human. And that's turned out to work pretty well.
I think that's a great perspective. I think that sort of summarizes a lot of the insight that hopefully people get from this conversation, because we've covered
quite a range,
pretty wide range of things. But to bring it back down, as you mentioned, I think that's pretty succinct. starts, ends at the human level. And cybersecurity is often thought of, again, hands on keyboard, binary, electrons shooting over wires, but it's
have this right tool installed, have a certain score of a CMMC.
Right. You configure the system, you turn this nut, that bolt a certain way, but it's a lot about the humans on
huge amount of a people problem or a people solution, depending on how you want to think about it. But people are the key.
So the world you and I live in can be, we talk a lot about threats, about scary stuff. Nation states trying to bring down the way of life. It lends itself to pessimism and cynicism. The tradition on the Watchers is trying to ground things in optimism because, again, I always find people in these roles are optimistic despite the challenges. So I always love to hear from people what, whether personal, professional, where you draw optimism from.
What I've found very optimistic for me is two things. One really work-related and one human-related. The work-related one is I think governments in general, always get a bad rap. I'm the government, I'm here to help. Maybe that's true at the political level. I don't know. I don't care.
Yeah.
When I'm dealing with the functional folks on the front line, the amazing talent that we have in those agencies and the work that they do gives me a lot of hope that when you hear stories like, ooh, China wants to ruin our way of life, that makes us feel like we're a victim. The United States is not a victim. We're at worst, a peer, but in many ways, the leader in many of these technologies things. And that's not me, Sean, is the leader. No. This is the folks doing the work at NSA or CISA or FBI, et cetera. When you meet those folks in the front line and you have conversations with them and you see the brain power and the passion and the mission focus they bring to bear, and then you hear some of the stories of the successes they have and the things that they're doing, there's a lot of reason to be optimistic about, hey, the Western way of life isn't going away because China said they have a goal, right? I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying we're not going to have a fight on our hands at some point or we don't have a war every day, but we're not a victim in this. We are very capable with some really motivated, awesome people that hopefully as when things settle down in DC are all still there, still doing their job, still on that wall, still watching, right, and doing that. And then I think at the human level, I think if you look at the success stories of a lot of major organizations out there with the focus on people, I draw a lot of optimism from just watching my folks and seeing them grow. But more than that, I'm used to, having gone through my career as an IT geek, being the smartest geek in the room, right? I worked my way up to this title and I'm the smartest geek, and I moved to this title and I'm the smartest geek. It is wonderful to me to walk into a room and just be out-geeked. I have these 5 creative ideas. I have a really diverse team. I don't care how you measure diversity, it's a super highly diverse team. And to walk into a room of all these folks from different backgrounds of all shapes and sizes going, hey boss, we have these 5 ideas. And I go, wow, I didn't think of 4 of those. And those are far better than the one I did think of. It gives me a lot of optimism that we're not stagnant as a culture, we're not stagnant as an industry, and that when you train folks, empower folks, believe in folks, they will produce better results and they will be able to hold their own in a battle against what seems like insurmountable odds. 1.4 million hostile Chinese actors feels like an insurmountable odds. But you walk into these rooms and you go, no, these guys got it. They've got their stuff together. They know what they're doing. All they need is support and empowerment to get to that goal. So
I love that. I think that's a show of confidence, and I love the optimism in that. So I can't think of a better note to end on, Sean.
Super.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for coming on.
Absolutely.
Do you have anything you want to plug? Book? You writing a book or anything like that?
No, I'm good.
All right. Well, cool. Well, we appreciate your work. We appreciate your sector. As I mentioned, maybe sometimes the unsung heroes of hurricane season and snow season and all that.
Yeah, just be nice to your linemen when you see them out in the field. Right? They're doing incredible work.
Don't disrupt them. Let them do the work. They're getting the power to your house. So awesome. Thank you again.
Thanks again.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Watchers. For more great content, be sure to like, subscribe, and check out our channel. We'll see you on the next one.